Hello and welcome to Adventures in Theater History, where we bring you the best stories from the deep and fascinating history of theater in the city of Philadelphia. I'm your host, Peter Schmitz, and our theme music is by Christopher Mark Colucci. Let's start today by going to the movies. Did you know there was a big-budget 1940s Hollywood musical about a World's Fair? No, not the one you're thinking of, not the Vincent Minnelli picture with Judy Garland and Margaret O'Brien, not Meet Me in St. Louis, a different Hollywood musical. This one was called Centennial Summer, and it was a nostalgic costume piece set in the good old Quaker City in the year 1876. The movie stars the actors Jean Crane, Linda Darnell, and Cornell Wilde, and it has a nice character role for Walter Brennan, too. It's about two Philadelphia sisters living in the Kensington neighborhood who both fall in love with the same Frenchman, a handsome young man who has come to town to set up the official French pavilion at the Centennial Exposition in Fairmount Park. Well, complications ensue, but eventually true love and American common sense win out. And so, because we have reached the beginning of summer here in 2026, I thought maybe we should look back to one of the most consequential years of Philadelphia's history, 1876, the year that Philadelphia hosted a World's Fair. So, about that film that we're listening to the theme song of, it's actually the last movie musical that the great composer Jerome Kern wrote the songs to. He died shortly after finishing his work on it. And except for his numbers In Love in Vain and All Through the Day, the score to this movie is mostly forgettable. But if you ever do catch it, look for it on YouTube, or maybe you'll find it on one of those movie channels on cable television. Stay tuned for the number that happens right towards the end, about an hour and 20 minutes in, when the great African-American singer and dancer Avon Long suddenly makes a special appearance, singing a song, Cinderella Sue, the Belle of Shantytown.
If my attitude is new and my mood is chipper, I'm the lucky fellow who found a crystal slipper. World is full of melody, magic things are happening. Never thought that I would be meeting royalty. Talk of sugar plums, talk of honeydew. Brother, here she comes, Cinderella Sue.
Now that's pretty good, isn't it? Now, it's not necessarily about the history of Philadelphia. I mention it because this song points to something that isn't really part of the movie. If you watch the whole movie, you'd say, Shantytown, where did that come from? Well, Shantytown was definitely part of the 1943 novel that the screenplay of the movie is based on. That novel was called Centennial Summer. It was written by Albert Idell, who had done his research because Shantytown was a real place. And according to Idell and his research, he noted that Philadelphians of that era did not just spend every day of 1876 making a pilgrimage to the official fairgrounds. They also partook of the amusements, entertainments, and theatrical life that were happening all around the city. In the novel, the characters go to the Art Street Theater. They go to New York to see plays, and they even visited the seedy neighborhood that had sprung up in the blocks around the World's Fair, and that was Shantytown, where, according to the author, one could find, quote, circuses and dance halls, variety shows and cabarets, displays of freaks and games of chance and skill, all tremendously exciting and teeming with people. And at yet another point in this novel, the main young couple visit the Alhambra Palace Theater on Broad Street across from the Academy of Music and see the fantastical extravaganza Around the World in 80 Days. So there we go. this is an aspect of the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exposition that I don't think has been covered much.
Happy ending too. If I can convince Cinderella.
You can find plenty of books and documentaries that cover things like the fair's architecture, its politics, the background of its social life, all the technological innovations. It was the first World's Fair ever in America. The telephone was first introduced to the public there. The hand of the Statue of the Liberty was there. But there's really very, very little about the theater history of the fair. And as so often is the case, the rich theatrical life of the Quaker City just gets overlooked. But hey, that's okay. You and I are here to fix that. So, in the spirit of the sweet charms of Cinderella Sue, the belle of Shantytown, let's talk to two guests that I contacted to fill us in on the story of this amazing time in Philadelphia's life. Later on, we'll talk to the cultural historian and blogger TravSD, but first, let's start with an interview that I had with the Philadelphia historian John Henry Hepp. John Henry Hepp, the fourth of that name, is Professor Emeritus of History at Wilkes University in Pennsylvania and was born and raised in Greater Philadelphia. Professor Hepp's teaching and research interests center on the effects of technological and economic change on everyday urban life. He has been interested in the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition since his childhood, when his grandparents would tell him stories of the fair while they drove through Fairmount Park. He is the author of the books The Middle Class City, Transforming Space and Time in Philadelphia from the University of Pennsylvania Press, and also Mystery and Marvel, Philadelphia's 1876 Centennial Exposition, published by Brookline Books. I spoke with Professor Hepp in June of 2026. John, welcome to Adventures in Theater History Philadelphia.
Happy to be here. I think we're going to have a lot of fun today.
Well, I hope so. You and I both had books that were put out by Brookline Books in 2024. So I've noticed your work right away, and it's got this striking picture on the cover of a hand with a torch, but it's not at the end of the Statue of Liberty. It's sticking out of a booth very much on the ground next to, like, what was that? Why is there this huge hand and torch in Philadelphia in 1876?
The Statue of Liberty was under construction at the time, and that is the Statue of Liberty's hand and torch. And you could pay, I forget what it was, I think a nickel, and go inside and go up it. So it was just part of all the excitement going on in Philadelphia, because suddenly there's things from all over the world showing up. And this is an odd thing from all over the world to be showing up, but an appropriate one.
Well, the previous World's Fair to this was in Paris, and we'll talk about the overwhelming French influence that we see in Philadelphia. But in 1868, there had been an exposition in Paris at the height of the La Belle Époque, celebrating the Second Empire of Napoleon III. And that had been a huge hit. When had they decided the next fair was going to be in Philadelphia?
Well, generally, there's actually a French bureau, the Bureau of International Expositions, that officially designates things World's Fair. Philadelphia is the sixth World's Fair on their list, and they begin 2 in London, 2 in Paris, and then 1 in Vienna.
Right.
If you think about it, they're all major world capitals. They were all done at the sort of the peak of both the economic and social power of the countries. And so they're all very exciting. Well, essentially, at the end of the American Civil War, people are looking for ways to heal after the Civil War. So starting in 1866, there got to be a lot of people saying, we should do something for the nation's centennial. We need to do some big event of some sort. The leading cities being recommended were, not surprisingly, Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. Pennsylvania and Philadelphia moved quickly on this idea, and they were starting to raise the money. And then they went to Congress and said, hey, Congress, do you want to help out? And Congress kind of like Congress today was a divided Congress with people not getting along. So we'll help out as long as it costs us no money whatsoever. But we want power to control it. We just don't want to pay for it.
Right. Well, I noticed that Philadelphia could say we have experience with organizing fairs because the huge Logan Square Sanitary Fair had taken place in 1864, which were an enormous building, had covered the entirety of Logan Square in the northwest quadrant of the city. And that had raised money for the care of wounded Civil War soldiers. And that had shown Philadelphia's ability and acumen in organizing huge events on an industrial scale.
Yeah. And the person who organized that, Welsh, also helped organize this fair. So they were actually, it wasn't just Philadelphia's experience, it was a particular person's experience that could come in here. Also, don't forget, at the time, it's easy for us that live in Philadelphia now to forget this. Philadelphia is the second largest city in the nation. New York City had yet to consolidate, and Manhattan wasn't that much bigger than Philadelphia, about 150,000 more people. And so consequently, Philadelphia had both the ability to do this and also the size. Because part of the challenge of New York City, kind of like to this day, is there's not a lot of free space in New York City. Especially Manhattan
They're only
Island.
just building Central Park.
Yeah.
But Philadelphia already had Fairmount Park, and it had more square acreage than any other city. Almost still does. It's just an enormous expanse of land.
Yeah. And so the Franklin Institute, which still exists in Philadelphia, back then it was actually a scientific study institute that also had a science museum, but not necessarily pitched to kids. They got in on the lobbying for Centennial very, very early, and they convinced the city of Philadelphia to lease for free 150 acres in Fairmount Park. And at the same time, strangely enough, the city of Philadelphia gave some more acreage to what's now the Zoological Society of Philadelphia. So the Philadelphia Zoo is kind of related to the Centennial Project.
Yeah, well, I noticed that the Philadelphia Zoo is listed under the amusement section in all the newspapers, right next to the theaters. We will bring this back to the theaters, but I noticed that public amusements at the time were rather broadly defined. And one of the reasons I'm happy to talk about this exhibition is that I like to broadly define theater and performance in terms of its history. So if you look at the amusement sections of the newspapers in 1876, not only did they have all the theaters and concert halls and operas that were going on, but they would also have the zoological gardens, which had just opened up as a place you could go and amuse yourself, and games of baseball, 2 words at the time, which were taking place often in essentially empty lots up in North Philadelphia. And the sort of culture of leisure was just building up in America at this time as something that a nation which was attempting to heal could do. Now, I guess we ought to mention that 1876 was also an election year. And of course, it was the famous contested election, which eventually was thrown to the Republicans in return for shutting down all the Reconstruction efforts that had been going on. So there was so much national drama going on. There was an effort of amusement. We could find a way to find a common narrative again for the country.
Yeah. And I think that's incredibly important to telling the story of the Centennial, because the Centennial is this very odd event that appeals to tons and tons of people at the time. I mean, it had 10 million guests paid to go there.
Centennial is the time to be very Centennial. Is a marvelous moment in May. A 50-cent note for a million and money to open our great exposition.
So, John, what were the highlights of the Centennial? How did people get there? How many people came there? What would they find when they get there? Give us sort of a quick rundown of what the thing is about.
If you weren't from Philadelphia, and about half the people weren't from Philadelphia, you got to Philadelphia by train. It was really almost the only way to travel inner city at the time. So consequently, most people arrived at one of the train stations. Now, the largest railroad company in America at the time was the Pennsylvania Railroad, conveniently headquartered in Philadelphia. And the Pennsylvania built this beautiful depot not far from the Centennial.
Along what was then called Elm Avenue, but we would now call Parkside Avenue.
That's right, yeah. And so people would arrive by train. They'd then have to find a place to stay. And the sort of funny thing about Philadelphia, and just off the grounds of the Centennial, which had been essentially empty between the Pennsylvania Railroad and Fairmount Park, were a series of hotels and amusements and everything else that sprung up to do exactly what, if you go to any national park today, the nearest town is full of today. Inexpensive places to get food and be amused. Some people would stay there. Other people would stay in hotels in Center City. Center City's a mile and a half, 2 miles, depending on where you are, from the Centennial grounds. So what they would do is they would take horse-drawn streetcars directly to the Centennial grounds. Philadelphia had the largest system of horse-drawn streetcars in the country in 1876. There's one day, Pennsylvania Day, where almost 300,000 people were on the grounds.
That was in September, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you're talking about basically the population of the city of Boston at that time was on these fairgrounds. And people got there and people got home using the horse cars.
So when they got there, what did they find? It wasn't just one big building as there had been in Paris, London, and Vienna.
Well, it was actually, I think, quite clever. What they decided to do is build 5 major buildings, a handful of secondary buildings, and then literally dozens of little tiny buildings.
Overall, the fair was called, not the Great Theatrical Exposition, but the International Exhibition of Arts, Manufactures, and Products of the Soil and Mine.
Yes.
But how did the product of the soil and mine, why did that attract hundreds of thousands of people?
Well, because first, while people who made enough money could travel by train, most people only traveled very occasionally. And so it was really wonderful in a way that we can't really understand today, of not having to go someplace to see all this cool stuff. So the 2 largest buildings on the thing were meant to be temporary buildings. They were designed by a railroad engineer, and honestly, they look like railroad train sheds.
That's kind of a marvelous thing. That was the marvelous invention of 19th century architecture, was these huge train sheds made out of cast iron frames with lots of glass panels that created these huge open airy spaces, great for the entrance and exits of rail lines, but also, as it turned out, great for huge temporary exhibition space.
That's right. And the best thing is, they're modular. They can be taken apart. And so the 2 biggest buildings, one basically had the manufacturers from around the world and all sorts of products. And then the other one was Machinery Hall.
And this was all being powered by famously a big central coreless steam engine, which whirled around and drove all these belts that ran throughout Machinery Hall, powering all these other smaller machines. So it was a huge spectacle in of itself, and people would come to that. They'd come to there was a special women's pavilion, I'd like to point out, and there was also a pavilion for agriculture and for mining products. People would spend their days, you pay admissions at the entrance, and then you'd walk around this fairgrounds. It's kind of like walking around a huge theme park that we know today, like Disneyland and Six Flags and those sort of things. But this was really the first one like that. That was a world within a world. And you could also view it, you're the railroad expert, there was a small train within the fairgrounds. Is that right?
That's correct. Going around the fairlines, and you mentioned, like an amusement park today, if you think of Disneyland and other places, there's often a train or a monorail that can take you around. Mm-hmm. They had this narrow gauge train, and kind of like what would go through the mountains. So not quite full size, but, steam locomotives, and it took you all around the grounds for a nickel. And you would either just stay on it and go around and do a sightseeing thing, or if you didn't really want to walk across the whole 150 acres, you could pay them a nickel and just go to the other side or go to wherever you wanted to go. And it was a great way to see things.
But there was sort of a meta-theatrical aspect to this exhibition itself. There were huge observation towers built higher up the hill. I think there was at least 2 of them. It just is on the slope of what is essentially a higher ground. And because at the very peak of it was this reservoir. So if you built a tower on top of that, you could really see quite far.
No, and there's a lot of photographs from that tower. Photographs, paintings, drawings. I have diary descriptions of going up the tower and seeing all the people look like ants, kind of the comments that we make when we fly over a city in an airplane.
Now, you mentioned earlier on that there was the official area of the park, and then there's a sort of the unofficial area of the park, the sort of down market area, which naturally springs up around huge cultural attractions. You can see that around Niagara Falls. You can see that in front of every national park, and you could see it springing up, people taking advantage of the influx of visitors And this was called Shantytown, right? And they really were shanties, right?
Well, it was called Shantytown by its detractors. The
I
real
see.
estate developers called it Centennial City.
I see. But it
But
was a lot of hastily built shacks made with planks and tents. They were hosting beer gardens,
yep.
little peep shows, circus events, places where you could see learned pigs, places where you could do shooting galleries and so forth.
The Philadelphia Times in April, a very conservative newspaper, said, I believe it's nothing but dens of debauchery.
Well, the Philadelphia Times, they love to print sermons from the preachers about how evil the theater was. And the other thing that was true about the Philadelphia Exposition was it was closed on Sundays because Philadelphia was a strict Sabbatarian city. So one of the things about the fair was it was hard for working class people to go sometimes because most people work Monday through Saturday.
Yep.
And it was not open on Sunday. So you had to take time off work if you wanted to go. Is that right?
Yep. That is correct. They did try an experiment. I believe it was open for 2 Sundays during the entire run before essentially every church in the city said, this is the end of the universe as we know it.
But this idea that somehow there was debauchery and immorality going on in these shantytown areas, was that really true? Or was it really just the fact that they were a public nuisance? They were a fire trap. In fact, they did catch on fire in September, right?
That is correct. Well, I think it's more of the latter because the people were very sensitive to it being a fire trap. You can read newspaper articles from April predicting what a disaster it was, and I will tell you those editors were quite happy in September when they had their fire.
Proven. No one was killed, I believe, but unfortunately, but it did wipe out a lot of the shantytown. But one thing it didn't wipe out. And one element that was in Shantytown, but right near the big train station we talked about, was an enormous cylindrical structure. And it was called the Siege of Paris. What was this cylindrical building? What was going on there?
Well, in the 1870s and 1880s, there was this fascination with what were called cycloramas or panoramas, and they usually consisted of these paintings in the circular structure that sometimes you put plays on in front of, sometimes you actually had props put on in front of them. And the Siege of Paris, if you will, while Napoleon III, you credited him for the previous Paris exhibition, is he declared war on Prussia as Prussia, bringing on the Franco-Prussian War, and eventually, in 1871, the siege of Paris by the Prussians, who took all the high ground and just shelled the city for a while. And this was a work of art by an artist whose entire career was making these cycloramas or panorama things. And I was fascinated when I found out that was at the Centennial. Again, because it's in Shantytown, it doesn't make a lot of the guidebooks. It was not mentioned in any of the diaries of nice middle-class folk that I followed in particular. But it was that fascination with being able to see something in Philadelphia, i.e. Paris, that you weren't probably going to see in your entire life.
So much of the fair was influenced by French design, by the idea of the French Beaux Arts style. That huge memorial hall, which you talked about, was done in the approved French Beaux Arts style with the curlicues and the decorations and the mansard roofs and so forth. And Philadelphia City Hall, which was going up in the middle of the city at the time, was also in that style. And French culture and architecture was everywhere. But there had just been this huge disaster between the 1868 exhibition and this 1876 exhibition. Paris had undergone a cataclysm. First, there had been the disaster of the Franco-Prussian War, which France had quickly lost, and Napoleon III was dethroned and thrown out. The Third Republic was founded, and then the Paris Commune had sprung up, and there had been a second siege by the conservative government of France to take over these commies that had taken over Paris, and the retributions afterwards was terrible. Apparently what was shown in this Philadelphia cyclorama was the execution of the Archbishop of Paris, a famous outrage conducted by the communards against the church. So this was sort of a sensationalistic, gory details with lots of battle scenes and lots of blood, similar to if anyone's ever been out to Gettysburg and seen the huge cyclorama that's still out there, which was painted. There's also one, I believe, of the Siege of Atlanta. There's other ones in Europe, the Siege of Sevastopol or things like that. I just say they're very popular. But it was part of the theatrical popular culture of the fair. In the long run, why should we, and I'm going to talk to Trav about this too, why should we remember the exposition as a cultural event? How did it resonate in the city at the time and subsequently?
Well, I think one way it definitely resonated in this city as a whole is suddenly realizing, heck, if Philadelphians get together, we can actually do something, which I always think is one great value of cultural events. What I love about the Centennial is it gave Philadelphians confidence that Philadelphia is just going to get better in the future, and let's figure out how we can do that and what we can do with it. I also think the cool thing about it is it brought in ideas from all over the world, is that affected a lot of local Philadelphians when they thought about culture. I mean, think of Frank Furness, who was an architect practicing at the time. And, and one of his, best examples is the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Center
Which
City,
was going up just at this time.
Yeah. And while he, strangely enough, despite being one of Philadelphia's leading architects at the time, had nothing to do whatsoever with the Centennial, I actually think all those ideas flowing in helped influence he and his followers the things that they could do in very different ways. I mean, I'm struck by the fact that suddenly things that used to be extremely foreign to Philadelphia, China and Japan, became a part of everyday life.
Even at the fair, and you mentioned Frank Furness, and he didn't have buildings in the Centennial, but he did have the entrance to the Philadelphia Zoo,
yes,
which was right there. And there was another building, the Horticultural Hall, which we mentioned, that was in quote unquote Moorish design.
Yes.
And reading about that made me realize why, and we'll talk about this with Trav, another building which went up just for the occasion of the fair, the Alhambra Palace on Broad Street, which looks like it's standing out like a sore thumb. What is this, North African or Spanish, dreamscape of a building doing on Broad Street opposite the Academy of Music? And now I get it. It's because Philadelphia began to see itself as part of a world culture where many different styles and influences could sort of flourish. And instead of the old Quaker Carpenter's Hall style design, we could have all sorts of international exotic influences. And it now makes sense to me why this was going on at that time. Well, John, thank you so much for talking to us about your deep knowledge of Centennial Exposition. It's been lovely meeting you. Lovely getting a chance to talk with you. Thank you for coming to Adventures in Theater Philadelphia.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
And now, to talk more about the cultural experience and most particularly the theatrical history of Philadelphia during the Centennial Exposition of 1876, I'd like to introduce our next guest on this episode. Donald Travis Stewart, known professionally as TravSD, is an American author, a journalist, a playwright, and a stage performer. In 2008, Trav launched the arts and culture blog Travalanche, which features thousands of biographies of vaudeville performers, burlesque acts, circus shows, sideshow carnivals, cinema figures, and radio performers and other show business professionals in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, as well as related news, reviews, and commentary. It is an online resource I turn to all the time myself when I want the lowdown on American cultural figures, great and small. Trav is also the author of the great book No Applause, Just Throw Money, about the history of vaudeville. I spoke to Trav over Zoom. TravSD, welcome to Adventures in Theater History Philadelphia.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for putting this together. I'm thrilled.
So, Trav, you contacted me. You reached out to me last December, pitching the idea that we should do this episode that we're recording now. So, what first attracted you to the idea of World's Fairs at all as a cultural phenomenon?
Well, yeah, well, let's just say I had the hope that there would be some theatrical activity at the 1876 World's Fair. Actually, a couple of different avenues that brought me to it. One is, I'm kind of a generalist. When I was a college kid and interested in comedy, I would steal away to the library. And I remember on one occasion going to some major reference book and looking up amusement, intending to look into comedy. And for the first time, sort of confronted it in the sense that we know of it from the P.T. Barnum orientation, if you will. And then as a New Yorker, very much interested in the two World's Fairs we had at Flushing Meadows in the 20th century. And also, because of my vaudeville research, did quite a bit of research on the 1893 one in Chicago that was ostensibly about the 400th anniversary of Columbus's journey. All of those are later, and they all have theatrical components. So an interesting topic for us today, I should think, is how and why it came to be later, and maybe not so much in the earlier Philly one. But the other thing that's got me interested about the Philly, is it insulting to Philadelphians if I say Philly?
No, not at all. We use it all the time.
All right. I feel disrespectful.
No, don't worry about it.
So, years ago, like in the 80s and 90s, the Smithsonian had a sort of recreation of Machinery Hall, which was one of the major exhibitions at the Philadelphia Exposition. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, there's a subculture that they call steampunk. I say now, I'm dating myself. That actually goes back a few decades as well. I think it's kind of over now. But a kind of fetishization for the machinery of the 19th century and hot air balloons and steam trains and locomotive power and steamships. And so that Smithsonian exhibit had a bunch of that machinery and adorned with this wonderful patriotic iconography, flags and bunting and stuff. And it really just sort of grabbed me. I don't know why I love it so much. I ended up adapting it for when I produced vaudeville shows, of trying to reflect that look. Something about that era of optimism and progress and such.
Right. Well, we talked to John Hepp about all those things, about what was in the center of the fair. We talked about the great Corliss steam engine and Machinery Hall and all the agricultural and mining exhibits that were going on the main fairgrounds. But around the edges of the fairgrounds, of course, entrepreneurs took advantage of the proximity to the fair to create their own commercial experiences. And this, as you pointed out elsewhere, can go back deep into the medieval period in European history, where things like St. Bartholomew's Fair in London or the Foire de Saint-Germain in Paris would have annual fairs with all sorts of booths and sideshows and popular entertainments, which would accrete around big annual expositions.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. And sometimes if you were less reputable, you wouldn't be admitted onto the proper, grounds of the fair, and you'd have to be on the periphery.
So we talked to John about how we can see. Now, let me share my screen, and I'm going to share this slideshow with our listeners. If they want to go to my website, www.aithpodcast.com, I'll have this on my blog post, these images that we're looking at. So here we're looking at what was a printed version of something called the Bird's Eye View of the Centennial Exposition Buildings and Grounds, Philadelphia. And as I talked about with John, these huge towers were being built by entrepreneurs. We can see one over here in the lower left corner where you could pay admission. This was outside the fairgrounds, but you would go up this huge tower so you could look down and see everything all at once on the hillsides above the fair. But this is a sort of an artist's view of what the fair looked like. We can see the huge main building. We can see the Elm Avenue here where the most visitors arrived. And we can see the Memorial Hall, which is now the Please Touch Museum. But you'll notice that over here on the right side of this image, and again, this is a drawing, not a photograph, it's kind of empty there. There's sort of empty lots here on the other side of Elm Avenue. And as we know, this was actually filled up between the train tracks and Elm Avenue. It was filled up with something called Shantytown. And it was filled with beer gardens and sideshows, learned pigs, counting chickens and all sorts of things that the newspapers wouldn't describe. This is disreputable. This is dirty. This is filthy. This isn't what we want to show our visitors. But obviously there was demand for it, or they wouldn't have shown up right about here, where number 32 is here. And that was something. So you can see a sort of cleaned up version of it, all colorized and with the city of Philadelphia in the background, including a sort of big white mound, which is the notional idea of Philadelphia City Hall, which wasn't built yet. So that's, I think, why it's in white. But you can see that the main part of the city is on the other side of the Schuylkill in the background beyond all these bridges. But we have an amazing scope of the main exhibition hall, of machinery hall. We have here's an exhibition of the turnstiles that John talked about. So we know exactly how many people showed up because they were counted by mechanical means. And we know how much was poured into this exhibition at a short time because of the availability of railroads, which came there along Elm Avenue and was able to offload things quickly and people in and out quickly. So it was an amazing vision of modernity as the world was now. But there were things there that were showing the idea of a world far away. Here we see laying out the model of the city of Paris. We see two French guys with little houses with a model of the Seine River, and they're putting the model of the city of Paris. But it was a bit messy on the grounds, as especially in July. We noticed it was very hot here in Philadelphia. Who knew that it would get hot in Philadelphia in July? And people would pass out, people would get heat stroke, and it really put a damper on the whole fair going experience, because people were literally, it was a sort of a health hazard. But we can see here that in the background there was this huge cylindrical building. Here's a photograph of it, way beyond it says the Siege of Paris. And here's a drawing that I found of it, the building that was thrown up by a Philadelphia theater owner, Fred Zimmerman, and this was a huge panorama building.
Wow!
Which had this enormous painting inside, a big circular painting, which showed Paris in its worst moments. And so much of Paris was destroyed. The Hotel de Ville was burned down. But what they would do apparently is there would be lights and little fires and fireworks that would go off inside there. The audience was in the middle, and they would watch all the siege of Paris happen in front of them. All this was being shown in this unofficial but highly sensational exhibit right outside the fairground. So to me, that's part of the theatrical life that doesn't often get talked about because it wasn't part of the official fair. June 5th, which was Monday of 1876, there's a little article from the Philadelphia Times where it talks about what else was going on in town. And it says, Caralfi's Alhambra Palace continues its popular attractions. Washington at Yorktown is on exhibition 23rd and Chestnut Street. Operti's Tropical Garden is one of the main attractions at the Centennial grounds. Cairncross and Dixie's Minstrels are still located at the 11th Street Opera House. At the Arch Street Opera House, the lovers of minstrel performances can be accommodated every evening. There's a new Irish drama coming there later. And at the very bottom it says, fine musical entertainments are given every evening at the Menneker Gardens, at the Fairmount Avenue, and on Franklin Street. So there were huge hotels that were right next to the fairgrounds. They were thrown up and then torn down immediately afterwards. But there were the main hotels were all in Center City, Philadelphia. And most people who came from elsewhere would stay there. And in the evenings, they would need, on those hot June and July evenings, they would need to find something to do. So what they were treated to, the garden concert, the Offenbach Garden, which was at the corner of Broad and Cherry Street, which is now where the huge Philadelphia Convention Center is. So This was a former railroad depot, and it had been turned into a interior exhibition space and a place where you could walk around and have cool drinks underneath huge potted palms that had been placed in there. What was this whole garden or beer garden entertainment? You've written about that on your Travel Lounge blog.
Yeah, well, there was the vogue for pleasure gardens, and I'm not sure where it originated, but, it was prior even to the movement for public parks. They would take a small patch of land or a building, and make a beautiful space where people could recreate in
Right. Well, we've
relatively.
talked about that on the podcast. We talked
Yeah.
about how Vauxhall Gardens there were gardens in Philadelphia. There were London and Parisian entertainments that
Yeah.
migrated to New York and Philadelphia. Madison Square Garden in New York is called a garden
Right.
because originally it was this sort of thing. It was a sort of garden place where you go in the evening and hear concerts and see vaudeville performances.
Yeah, something similar to a park, but generally with entertainments and stuff. And sometimes, at the bigger one, like at Vauxhall, you might see balloon ascensions and such.
Right.
But more often than not, it would be just some kind of pleasant background music. In an era when the puritanical prejudices of lots of people were such that even going to listen to music was considered frivolous. And
right. And we've noticed, I can see in the newspaper that one July evening, this Offenbach garden, where Jacques Offenbach, the Parisian composer, had come in June to give concerts. It was named after him because he actually showed up.
Wow.
But it, like almost everything else in Philadelphia, needed to be closed on Sunday. Philadelphia was a strict Sabbatarian city. The whole fair was shut down on Sunday.
Right.
No theater on Sunday. There was nowhere to go. But the neighbors complained that they were still having concerts at this Offenbach garden on Sunday, and that the church across the street couldn't hear the minister because the band was playing so loud. And they arrested the whole restaurant crew and called them into court for violating the Sabbath. But there were other gardens, the Operti's garden out in the fairgrounds, or there was the Edwin Forrest's house at Broad and Master Street in North Philadelphia. He had died just a few years before that. But for that summer, the garden of his house was turned into another one of these pleasure gardens where you could go in the evening and hear music and concerts and hear variety performances.
Wow. So his house was a tourist attraction itself way back then.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Right.
Us New Yorkers love Edwin Forrest for triggering a fabulous Shakespearean riot.
Oh, yes. Well, we've talked about it often on the podcast, although my point is that Forrest had nothing to do with it.
Sure.
And he said so himself. It was all down to New York politics. He was in the Broadway theater way down the road. Nothing to do with him.
Minding his own business.
That's right. He didn't start anything. But now on South Broad Street, where the Academy of Music was and still is, and here I have this great print of it, which was published in The Stranger's Guide to Philadelphia, which was published in 1876 for tourists who were coming to town, and was trying to encourage people to see things that were elsewhere in the city. If you've come in from Cleveland or Toronto or Boston or from St. Louis to come and see the huge fair, what are you going to see when you get to Philadelphia? So it was a guidebook like this would show off the highlights of the city, and the Academy of Music, which was at that point about 20 years old, was certainly one of the prime attractions. But across the street from it, there was a coal yard. And they had recently built the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts on North Broad Street, all in this wild Frank Furness, semi-Moorish style. But then there was another horticultural hall in the fairgrounds, and I'm looking at a picture of it now. And I wanted to see that in particular because it was often described as Moorish as well. And if we look at this illustration of it, we can see that the sort of repeating windows, the sort of ogee arches, and the minarets that were adorning it were trying to show sort of an Orientalism. We can see there's a little onion dome on the top of one of the porticos here. This all enclosed a huge, enormous greenhouse which had all the plants and the tropical gardens inside it. So here's a photograph of it. But this building explains to me why what they built in the coal yard was a version of this. There was something called the Alhambra Theater in London, which everybody would have known. And we can see again that it was done this was on Leicester Square. This used to stand on Leicester Square in London, where the Shakespeare statue is now. It was this huge popular theater with minarets on it. And again, those huge sort of Arabian style arches. It was supposed to be an exotic version of the Palace of Alhambra. And that explains to me this. It was only in investigating this exhibition I finally understood why this was built the way it was. On that old coal yard across from the Academy of Music, two guys named Imre and Bolosi Kiralfi built in about 4 months this amazing theater, which was called Kiralfi's Alhambra Palace and Summer Theater and Concert Garden. Who were Imre and Bolosi Kiralfi? Do you know, Trav?
A little bit, yeah. They were, I think, Hungarian.
They were. They're from Budapest. Originally, by the way, their name was Königsbau.
That's right.
They were from a Jewish family, but
right.
They changed their name to the more classy sounding Kiralfi, I guess.
And they were crazy about dancing even from childhood, and were indulged by a dad who later they went to Paris and studied formally. And then they developed as a creative team that was expert at putting on these large spectacles featuring dance, but theatrical spectacles.
Right.
And they did a remount of the famous New York show, The Black Crook.
Right.
At
They were
Niglo's
famous.
Gardens.
They were famous for this huge version of The Black Crook, which had from the 1860s, which they adapted and toured and made more and more spectacular. And they had seen the Le Tour du Monde, this theatricalized version of a Jules Verne novel about going around the world in 80 days. And they also knew about his book, The Trip to the Moon. Kiralfi's Alhambra Palace was built to house their production of Around the World in 80 Days, which again was this way that you could see the entire world on stage and all these amazing, we're looking at an image now of the scene when Fogg is crossing India by rail. And of course he rescues a princess from Sati from burning herself on her husband's pyre. This is all, if you know the Jules Verne story. Why was this what people who were coming to see the 1876 Centennial Exhibition would want to see, Trev? What do you suspect?
Well, I feel like the world was starting to become a lot smaller, among other things. Like the idea that you could go around the world in 80 days was like a science fiction concept, but also rooted in reality. You know, theoretically you could. Colonialism's happening at the same time. It's interesting to me that Jules Verne, a Frenchman, wrote it as an English character, Phileas Fogg. But also, I strongly suspect that lingering legends about this production is maybe what later inspired Mike Todd to do his big Broadway production.
Oh, I think absolutely.
And Orson Welles as well.
Yeah.
In Mike Todd movie, of course, which we know today.
Right.
But there was a whole vogue for what they called Orientalism at the time. It was not just exotic, but suddenly there was much better access to it.
And that's what really makes the exterior and the interior of the theater make sense, that both the exterior and the show inside were meant to show this vision of the world that was now accessible to Westerners. And it plops down on Philadelphia across from the, amidst all the other, Quaker primness of churches and cultural buildings, this just exotic confection of a building, which lasts, I'd like to point out, well into the 20th century. Over time, it lost a lot of its exterior details. We can see by the early 20th century, it had acquired a plainer front. It still had these huge onion domes. It is now, by the way, the site of the huge parking garage next to the Wilma Theater. So we can see it here. It came down in the 1930s for a parking lot, just like everything else. Next to the Alhambra Palace, on the corner of Broad and Locust, was another huge circular panorama. And again, it was owned by Fred Zimmerman. And it was sort of a companion to that Siege of Paris cylindrical building that was by the fairgrounds. But this one was called the Colosseum. Here we see the cover of a handbook advertising it called The Cyclorama of Paris by Night. What was going on inside here? So again, this was erected just for the fair and standing there on the corner.
Sort of some sort of take on the City of Light.
Well, yeah, it was. I looked into it, and it turned out that this was a building that had first been built in London. It was called the London Coliseum, and it showed it's sort of London's rival city. at a time when London was not regarded as fun and as racy and as exciting as Paris. So it showed you Paris by night, and it had all these mechanical ways of illuminating different parts of and now the Trocadero, and now the Champs-Elysees, and now this. And it was a steampunk kind of way of giving you a travelogue of Paris. P.T. Barnum bought it and took it to New York and set it up on the corner of 36th Street, where it stood for a couple of years. And then I guess it had gotten old for New Yorkers, and so Fred Zimmerman bought it from P.T. Barnum and moved it all down to Philadelphia. You could go up that tower, you can see here at the top, and you could take pictures looking down. And here's this great photograph, which now is explained to me. This was taken from the top of the Coliseum, looking down on the onion domes of what became the Broad Street Theater next door to house the Kiralfy's Oriental Splendor. I note that by July, they switched over Around the World in 80 Days to a version of Jules Verne's A Trip to the Moon. But apparently that didn't sell so well. The July heat was killing the crowd. So they switched back to Around the World in 80 Days. And it ran the rest of the year there. Now, the Kiralfys have an afterlife. As you mentioned, they were famous for doing The Black Crook. But I noticed that Imre went on to build huge theaters and fairgrounds in Paris and London. In fact, he was responsible for building what was called the White City outside the London Olympics in 1908. And again, this huge Orientalist view.
Wow.
It's now where Earl's Court is, and where the huge television building is there now. It's all gone. But at one point, you could tour the Orient in the West End of London, and it was all part of this journey that he undertook originally in Philadelphia, trying to make the Orient manifest in the middle of a Western city, and people would show up by the thousands to come stroll around and hear concerts. Which reminds me of another theater. Now, this is the theater I've just been performing in for the past 4 months. This is my old friend, the Walnut Street Theater. Have you been to the Walnut?
I have indeed. Oh,
Yeah.
yes. Well, I'm something of a Marx Brothers expert, and their first Broadway show. They used to break in their Broadway shows there. Or at least
I'll Say She Is.
I'll Say She Is was the first.
Yeah, we've talked about that.
Yeah.
But before it was renovated in 1920, the Walnut Street Theater looked like this. It was sort of an accretion of the original design. And we can see that there was a cigar store there on the corner. But notice over here on the right is a picture of it from 1874. It always had a big flag on the top. It sometimes was called the American Theater because, again, it's only 2 blocks away from what we now call Independence Hall. It's in the older part of the city. But it didn't yet have on its facade something which it got later, which is this sign at the top which says oldest in America. And it was in fact on July 4th, 1876, when the city of Philadelphia finally woke up to the fact that it was the birthplace of the nation, and it began to revamp what had been for years the actual city hall. What we now call Independence Hall was the City Hall of Philadelphia. It's where the city government was. And all the spaces had been divided up. So they tore all that out and they rebuilt and reset up the room where the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were debated and written. And they had a ceremony there on the 4th of July, even though it was beastly hot. Mr. Goodwin, who ran the Walnut Street Theater, decided that this is the way to market the Walnut Street Theater, is to talk about its connection to the history of America. And that's when they really began to market the place as something that dated to 1808, a place where just going there was part of participating in American history. And we'll note that on the 4th of July, the play they scheduled had the word America in the title, but it isn't the one you expect. It was Our American Cousin. What was Our American Cousin, Trav?
That's the last play that Abraham Lincoln ever saw, and he unfortunately didn't see the whole thing.
Yeah, he only saw half of it.
I was amazed to hear that it was still in popular circulation after the assassination. It speaks to the popularity of the play.
Yeah, well, what it had become was essentially a way of this a character which had started as a minor character, was just in one or two snippets. This guy named called Lord Dundreary. And if you've ever heard of Lord Dundreary whiskers, you know that these huge pendular, sideburns. He was sort of a version of Bertie Wooster, a guy that was led around by his valet. And he was Mr. E.A. Southern, a British actor. He couldn't get away with anything else. He was so famous for doing this. He had to always do Lord Dundreary. And he came to do it at the Walnut Street Theater, but he made a mistake. He went to the fairgrounds in the middle of July and he got sunstroke.
Right.
Like hundreds of other people, he got bowled over by the heat. And we can see here from this article, partial sunstroke and the effects which he is still suffering induced his physician to order him a much needed rest. So by July 14th, he canceled his run, and the Walnut had to scramble and find someone else to fill the building. And by the end of August, we know who had shown up there was one of your favorite people of all time. Tony Pastor had arrived with his traveling group of vaudevillians to fill out the rest of the summer run. Who was Tony Pastor?
I like to call him the father of vaudeville. It's arguable, but you can make the case that he's the father of what became vaudeville, maybe the first among equals. He was a New York performer who'd started out in childhood with circuses. He performed at P.T. Barnum's American Museum. He'd been in minstrel shows, and he became popular on his own account as a singer, and he became something like the equivalent of a chairman in a music hall. He began to host shows, which was kind of unusual back then, and he would lead the audience in these sing-alongs, and he became so popular that, having started out on the Bowery in saloons, he gradually kept trading up, owning his own venues, and kept trading up to nicer and nicer spots until he reached the Rialto on Union Square, where he, over time instituted reforms. The prejudice that Philadelphians had against theater and theater culture and various entertainment forms was to a certain extent earned.
Yes, I'm afraid it was.
So, you kind of have this dichotomy, like this binary between people who have nothing to do with the theater and then people who go to the theater, but the theater is just a den of vice and gambling and smoking cigars and
the
booze.
can. And the can. Another thing imported from Paris. Yeah.
You can see a lot when you watch the can.
Right.
So, and so, in New York, the variety scene, you would go to hear singers and dancers and acrobats and such in variety theaters and saloons and dime museums. But gradually, in a process probably started by P.T. Barnum, but continued by Tony Pastor, it got cleaned up. So there was no swearing, nothing risque, no alcohol, and these rules of behavior in a theater. In New York, in the Bowery, the audience was just as noisy as the show, or more so very often. So gradually you did away with allowing that. There were even bouncers early on to sort of throw out unruly
It was noted
people.
in the ads that he's brought family entertainment. I mean, he had brought,
Right.
performing little people. There was tiny little people who were on display, but there were also acrobats and singers and dancers. And he stayed a couple weeks, but there were other people doing this type of entertainment in Philadelphia. This was the type of entertainment that usually came to this theater that we're looking at now, which is still there in one sense. I talked about it in my recent episode on the ghost theaters of Callowhill Street. It's now a gym. It's now where you can go rock climbing and take yoga classes. But in the 1870s, it was the National Theater at 10th and Callowhill, a former circus place. It's where Forepaugh had originally rivaled P.T. Barnum, originally at his circus. And it was now owned by another theater owner in Philadelphia. And he had been arrested for allowing the can to happen on his theater, women dancing and showing off their underwear. But by 1876, they were trying, and I think this is, again, why this moment is sort of a sea change in American culture. They were arguing this was now family entertainment. They were going to do something highly respectable, and they were going to do The Black Crook that summer and fall, because, again, the exhibition went on through October, so people were still coming from around the country to see it. The weather had cooled down a bit. And if you were staying in central Philadelphia, why not go to the National Theater and see Annie Kemp Bowler, the original Stalacta, in The Black Crook, which the Karolfis later made even more famous. But poor Annie Kemp, the very night that Tony Pastor showed up at the Walnut Street Theater, Annie Kemp Bowler had a terrible accident on the stage of the National Theater, just a few blocks to the north of the Walnut. I write about this in my book. Annie falls down. She was being drawn up in the air by a cable, and something snapped, and she plunged to the stage. She broke her collarbone, and it's not clear exactly how. Maybe some of her bone marrow leaked out from the break. But she then, a few hours later, she was dead.
Wow.
Heart attack. And there was a huge outpouring of grief in the city because she was a well-known performer. All the theatrical profession gathered around to raise money for her burial. And the Actors' Order of Friendship buried her in Mount Moriah Cemetery, where her monument still can be seen today. But the show went on, of course. I find this photograph of the Black Crook of the National Theater taken as late as November of 1876. It's the only evidence I have of the interior of the theater when it still was a theater. But both The Black Crook and another show which came to the Walnut that fall, Edward Rice's Evangeline, sort of show us where American popular showbiz was going. And that is the birth of the American musical. Evangeline, which we talked about on the podcast, was it was based upon a famous poem, but it really was sort of light entertainment. It got a terrible review in the Philadelphia Inquirer. There is not a funny situation or idea in the whole piece from beginning to end. The dialogues are the poorest doggerel and crammed with puns so execrably bad that the audience soon abandoned the idea of laughing at them and listened in stolid silence. So I guess my point of all that is, does the 1876 moment in American culture begin to move us into a different era in American theater life, in American show business? What do you think?
Well, it's one thing that was interesting to me is Pastor coming down there as early as 1876.
Well, he'd been touring around the country. That's what.
Sure. Yeah. But it's prior to the great flagship that he founded in Union Square that kind of has a reputation to this day. So It was prototypical, in other words, like the kind of performers, maybe that early he had Maggie Klein, was one of the singers who performed in his show, who was from the Bowery. Harrigan and Hart were around by then.
Right.
Acts like that. But it's sort of prototypical to the classic era of show business that we know happened just a little bit later. I bet they learned some things by putting on this fair in terms of organization.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of what they learned has to do with this technology that sort of was writing, that the fact that railroads could take you everywhere, the fact that Tony Pastor could take his company to Buffalo and Cleveland and Chicago and Philadelphia all in one summer and then loop back to New York, so he's there by September so quickly, heralds the beginning of the touring combination companies, which were going to, and the road, which was going to rule American show business for the next 50 years. And the end of the old stock company. This is the era when Mrs. Drew and the Walnut Street Theater lay off their resident stock companies because they can always have another show coming in by train from New York whenever they need one.
It occurred to me that several things that debuted in a public way at this fair fed into the organization of the circuits that later happened, without telephones and telegraph, with phones and
the telephone was another famous invention that was first exhibited at the fair.
And so that enabled managers and agents and bookers and acts to make deals instantaneously, whereas in the past you'd have to send something by mail, often very unreliable mail. Typewriters were new, very handy for contracts. And they were presented there at the fair. And the steam power, this whole thing of steam power, like you said, the trains, but also steamships, allowed acts to come over from London and Paris, and it only take a few days to get across as opposed to much longer from the days of sail. So that ends up being the infrastructural side of things, the business side of things. But also there was a legitimization of show business that was bestowed on acts that had previously been discredited, and it became okay for women and children to come and see entertainment for its own sake.
Right. People could go and see the fair and not feel like they had participated in something dirty and down market. They had done something which was respectable, which was family friendly, which they could wear their best clothes to, and they could maintain their social standing. In fact, increase their knowledge of the world and their sophistication by attending.
And there's that interesting, things were naive in certain ways in the 19...
Right. But I think the shows like Around the World in 80 Days and Coralfi's Alhambra Palace, where we're sort of taking that same impulse. We're excited by the exotic. We're excited about things that seem strange and weird, but we can cast it in a way that gives it an intellectual and social and cultural respectability that now gives our curiosity about it the aura of a investigation and of a more of a genteel exploration rather than a lurid and prurient interest in what's weird and odd. Instead of looking at performing midgets, we are looking at the scientific study of the human body. We are, instead of being sort of luridly looking at what happens when people burn to death, we go like, well, no, here's a curious custom of the East that now the West is overcoming. Well, in the long run, why should we remember the exposition as a cultural event, not just a scientific and commercial and political one?
I think it does have something to do with that legitimizing we were talking about. It was proper for middle-class people to go out and just spend a little bit of their money on their own entertainment, which was considered decadent in the extreme. And it's definitely some Parisian influence. My specialty, vaudeville, the very word is from France.
Exactly.
All these words are from theater, restaurant, anything to do with pleasure.
Right. I think France permeates this entire fair. I think the Parisian culture, 19th century, was very much built upon both London, but I think very much Paris was building the idea of what the city of the future would be and how people would exist in the world.
Also, it was a landmark in the scale of it, because over 20 years earlier, there had been a sort of early stab of replicating the London one in New York's Crystal Palace.
Right.
And it was one building, not particularly spectacular, I guess, in terms of how the fair turned out. But this was like a miniature city within a city, the one in Philadelphia. Oh, I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
The tower in the middle of the Paris building you were telling me about, is it the same one that was later moved to Coney Island?
Possibly. I would have to look into that more.
There was a 300-foot tower that was supposed to be from this fair, and it was one of the first sort of large amusement-style attractions to go at Coney Island after the fair closed.
I search these things out in the newspaper archives. You can see some, this guy bought this up and he's moving it all over here. After the World's Fairs, there's always this moment when everything gets torn down and then gets recycled in some way. The pavilions often get bought up and torn down and then reassembled elsewhere and moved to other areas of popular entertainment. So it wouldn't surprise me at all that parts of the 1876 World's Fair were disassembled, shipped over to Coney Island, put up at the next great permanent fairground. I mean, the Coney Island and what happens there in the late 19th, early 20th century becomes one of the amazing monuments of American popular culture. You still perform in that part of the world, don't you?
Indeed, I do. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. It's had a renaissance over the past 40 years or so. It's not what it used to be, but
nothing is.
Central Park also has a piece of the Philadelphia World's Fair.
What is that?
The Swedish pavilion from the fair was this cabin like a fairy tale cottage, and it's where the Marionette Company performs in Central Park. It's called the Swedish Cottage.
Oh, how about that?
Yeah, it's a lovely place. I actually married a couple there of puppeteers, of course.
You got married to a couple?
No. Yeah, I told you I was from New York.
No, you were
no
the
Quakers here.
You were the officiant. I get it. Trav, thank you so much for talking with us today. And thank you for suggesting this topic to me. I wouldn't have come back to it without you. And
Thank you for indulging me. I feel like I'm taking Coles to Newcastle here, but it's, been a lovely conversation.
I hope to be meeting you in person someday.
Yes.
I'll be up in New York, or you can come down here and we can exchange more tidbits of fascinating cultural information.
That's a date. I love your show. I tell people about your show all the time.
God bless you. Well, thank you. All right. Well, that's our show for today. I'd like to thank John Henry Hepp and TravSD for being our wonderful guests today on the show. Thank you so much for joining us again as we revisited the Centennial Exposition of 1876. I'm Peter Schmitz. We'll be back again with another show in a few weeks as we return to our subject of the modern Philadelphia theater movement. And as the train pulls out of the station for the last time at the end of the movie Centennial Summer, we'll all get aboard. Thank you so much for coming along with us on another adventure in theater history, Philadelphia.